In the behavior science world, there's something called behavioral contingencies. More commonly, sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the ABCs of behavior change. And ABC simply stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And this relates not only to behavior change, but also to obedience. So in obedience, the antecedent may be a command, maybe the fact that I say sit. And the behavior is the dog actually sits. And then the consequence would be that I give them a treat for sitting. And if there's a history of that consequence, then it's more likely that when I say sit, the dog is actually going to sit in the future. This concept relates to obedience as well as to behavior change. So in obedience, the antecedent is often a cue. So for instance, me telling my dog sit. The behavior is he actually sits. And then the consequence is I give him a treat or another form of reward. And the history of doing that is going to make the dog more likely to sit when I say sit. So we have the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So when we're trying to change behavior, we want to look at a couple things. Can we control the way the antecedent relates to the behavior itself? Can we control the natural reinforcers that are in place? And then are there other consequences that we can introduce that would affect that chain of behaviors? And so we're always thinking about these three components and how we can manipulate them to create behavior change. There is, however, a fourth component that sometimes gets overlooked and I find to be particularly important. The technical terminology for this fourth component is a function-altering stimuli. And ultimately what a function-altering stimuli is sort of any preceding factor that might affect either how a dog responds to the cue or trigger or how effective the consequence may or may not be. If we start to live with our dogs in a more controlled way, meaning we put more parameters on their behavior, we give them more rules, we give them a little bit more structure and discipline throughout their day, what ultimately is going to happen is we're going to be changing their mindset a little bit. Their attitude is going to shift a little. But also through those parameters and through that discipline, our dogs are going to be regularly practicing some really important skills. Things like impulse control, self-discipline, and willpower. Particularly impulse control and willpower are almost like muscles. They have to be developed. You have to use those skills regularly for them to maintain strength. And so if we live with our dogs in such a way that our dogs practice impulse control on a regular basis, that's going to really influence how our dogs may respond to whatever behavior contingencies we set up later on, and our dog's capacity for being able to deal with things in the way that we want, right? Likewise, if you don't live with your dog in such a way that your dog views you in a respectful manner, and I hesitate here to use the term leadership because it gets tossed around a little bit too loosely in dog training communities. But essentially, if you don't have the type of relationship with your dog where your dog sees you as an authority figure, and the dog recognizes that sometimes you're going to follow through if they're engaging in behaviors that are really unhealthy or potentially dangerous, and that there's going to be consequences for those behaviors. And then we just try and dive in and set up behavior contingencies for problem behaviors right away. That's really going to affect how your dog responds to any type of unpleasant consequences or corrections later on. If you've never corrected your dog and never taught your dog how to deal with that, a variety of things could happen. Your dog could respond very negatively to those corrections because up to that point it hasn't been a part of the plan. It really hasn't been part of their relationship with you, and they have no way of understanding why that's happening. But what also happens quite frequently is we see people correcting their dogs, but the dog's not taking them seriously. And because of that, you then get people who will then want to correct their dogs in a stronger or harsher way, when really often that's not needed if we set up the environment properly ahead of time. So the way I tend to explain this is, I own a training center and I have 10 employees. It's normal because of the hierarchy that's already established that if I tell somebody that something needs to get done, that they're going to do it. And if somebody does something that's against our policies, which doesn't happen often, I have a great staff, but if it did happen, or if somebody failed to do something they were asked to do multiple times, and I were to sit them down and have to have a disciplinary talk with them, they're going to take it in an appropriate way because that relationship is set up. They know that I'm the owner of the company. They know that I'm in a position of authority and that I'm simply doing my job by establishing those boundaries on their behavior. However, if one of my employees tried to do the same to me, if they sat me down and tried to order me around and tell me what to do and then discipline me for not following their orders, it wouldn't work because the relationship isn't set up in that way. I would probably think it was very strange. I'd probably have to consider firing that person. But either way, I wouldn't take it seriously because they're not in a position of authority to me. So their consequences are not going to hold the same weight. That relationship has just not been established. And the same goes with our dogs. If you have been living with your dog in such a way that your dog views you as maybe a peer, so they might view you as simply a friend that's on equal terms with them and you guys are just roommates and buddies, or in some cases the dog actually does see the owner as inferior to them, then that's going to really affect how your dog is going to respond if you have to administer any type of corrections or punishment down the line. So we want to make sure that we're setting our dogs up sort of with some preliminary framework as far as our relationship and our lifestyle goes that's really going to support and enhance what we're doing within those ABCs of behavior. So essentially, the way we live with our dogs, the amount of regular boundaries and parameters that we put on them on a regular basis, whether we've taught them in what ways there are going to be consequences for behavior and how to deal with those consequences in a controlled way that allows them to be successful and learn how to deal with them without stressing out. By doing that, we're really creating what would be considered function-altering stimuli that's going to support everything else that we want to do. And so the reason that this is important and the reason I wanted to talk about it is because ultimately that's the purpose of this course. This course is to help you guys set that framework for long-term success. We have already created a course on leash reactivity through Leerburg, and we're going to be creating other behavior problem courses. And it was extremely important to me that people, before diving into those courses, are laying the groundwork so that they can really be truly successful with their dogs. The way I always put it is trying to dive right into the behavior problems would be like trying to teach somebody how to do backflips who hasn't even learned how to walk yet. So this course is really designed to teach you how to walk, run, and maybe do a cartwheel. It's really designed to give you those skills that are setting you up to deal with the more complex problems later. Or perhaps you'll find that after completing this course, you no longer are having those problems that you thought were really serious problems. They could have simply been functions of not having a good foundation of discipline and structure in place to begin with.